Okay, good morning. Today is September 10th. And let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. We were talking about the scientific revolution, and we had mentioned Isaac Newton, who is the father of modern physics, but was also a brilliant scientist in just about every field that existed at the time. And Newton's seminal work, his masterpiece, is Principia Mathematica. And it is in this that he outlines the universal law of gravitation. He talks about optics, just all kinds of very important scientific subjects that will then be built on by future scientists to bring us to the modern era. Now, and I believe that we had talked about Newton's world versus Einstein's world, or Newton's universe versus Einstein's universe, and how Einstein is able to figure out why the speed of light always remains constant regardless of how fast we're going. And that is simply because what Newton didn't understand is that time itself actually shifts with motion. And so we don't have space, we have space-time. And so that is the basis of Einstein's theory of relativity, as well as an awful lot of stuff that I don't understand, but is still pretty cool. Einstein's most famous, best-known algorithm or equation is E equals mc squared. We've all heard of this before, right? Well, what it means is energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Now, if the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second, 186,000 miles per second squared is one heck of a big number, isn't it? And so what that means is that matter itself, physical atoms, contain this much energy. They contain the amount of energy that is speed of light times itself. In other words, matter contains just an awesome amount of energy. Now, what does that lead to in the 20th century? What new field of science does that open the door to? Can anyone tell me? That opens the door to nuclear science, because this is the basis for nuclear reactions. Okay, this is the basis for nuclear reactions. Now, when we think of nuclear reactions, what first comes to mind are nuclear weapons, right? Well, nuclear bombs, the first versions that use plutonium and uranium, would simply split the atoms open and release the energy that existed within those plutonium and uranium atoms. And of course, that releases an awful lot. But using this theory, they were able to create much, much more powerful nuclear weapons. And I'll explain to you how, using Einstein's equation. If we take two hydrogen atoms. Now, how many protons and electrons does a hydrogen atom contain? Y'all took chemistry. No, hydrogen contains one, right? One proton, one electron, right? So we take two hydrogen atoms, each with one proton and one electron. If we cram those together really, really hard, if we put an enormous amount of force on them, these two hydrogen atoms can fuse into one. And so instead of having one proton and one electron and two atoms, we have one atom with two protons and two electrons. Now, on the periodic table, what has two protons and two electrons? Helium, right? So if we take two hydrogens, cram them together really hard, we get a helium. But helium contains substantially less energy than hydrogen. So what ends up happening is, when you cram those two hydrogens together, you get helium plus a release of all of that extra energy. And since that energy is the speed of light times itself, you get one heck of a release of energy. You get a massive explosion. And that is what type of bomb? The hydrogen bomb. So you've heard the term the hydrogen bomb. That's how a hydrogen bomb works on a very, very simple scale. Two hydrogens, cram them together, create a helium, and all of that extra energy gets released. Well, I'm not a big fan of nuclear war. I'm not a big fan of using nuclear weapons, and I'm certainly you're not either. And so the peaceful application to this would be a way to control putting the two hydrogens together, to find a way to control the reaction to where all that energy isn't released at once. And that's a process called cold fusion. You see, this is a fusion reaction, two hydrogens fused into one helium. And so cold fusion or controlled fusion would be figuring out how to take this and do it in a way that does not release all the energy at once, but does it in a very gradual way. If that could be done, if that could be perfected, all we would need is a little bit of hydrogen, and I mean a little bit of hydrogen, and we could power the earth indefinitely, and the only byproduct would be a little bit of helium, which of course would be magnificent for humanity. We're not there yet, but an awful lot of work is being done. Where does it all start? Well, it all starts with Newton, doesn't it? Right? It all starts with this guy several hundred years ago. Scientific progress may not be something that you see in your lifetime, but you still have to march toward it, don't you? We still have to put the research and the energy and the effort and the expense into learning this, because what we end up doing is creating a better world. And it may not be for us, it may be for future generations. And let's hope we don't use this technology to blow each other up anymore. Let's move forward. Here's more Principia Mathematica. Let's talk about biology and chemistry very quickly. Earlier scientists, pre-scientific revolution thinkers, were, of course, very interested in how the human body works. During the medieval era, there were people that called themselves doctors that did make very real attempts to help people who were sick. But of course, they didn't really understand what makes us sick or how the body works. The going idea leading into the scientific revolution was that the human body has a series of humors in it, a series of substances. And you get sick when the humors in your body get off balance. Blood is a humor, saliva is a humor, bile is a humor, et cetera, et cetera. And so if your humors are off balance, you will end up getting sick. That was generally what they would do. And so medical treatment was generally designed to balance these back out. Now, what was the most common medical treatment when people got sick at the time? Notoriously wrong, but it was practiced for hundreds of years. What was it? What would they do? If you got the flu or you got a cold or something and you go to the doctor and you're sick, what are they going to do to you?
Didn't they pour boiling water on you?
Well, they would heat up. One thing that they would do, this is what I'm thinking about, but yeah, one thing they would do is they would take glass cups, right, glasses, and they would heat them up, and then they would put it on your skin and blister your skin. And the idea was that helps your humors get balanced. I'm not exactly sure how, but there we go. And so blistering was one technique. Yeah, and they would put you on your stomach and put blisters all on your back. I don't know. I guess they thought it worked. You tell me. But what was the most notorious way? What's that? Well, no, we don't have that yet. That's not invented till the 19th century. Bleeding. Y'all, now y'all remember. Yeah, we would bleed each other. Now, bleeding was designed to balance the humors. Right? You've got too much blood in you, and so there we go. But you got to think, this isn't entirely outrageous. Now, it doesn't work, and it doesn't make you better. If anything, it's only going to make you worse. But casual observation would actually make you think that this might have something valid to it. Because you see, I want you to think about this. When you get the cold or when you get the flu, when you really feel bad, most of the time, what you really want to be able to do is just chug a bunch of NyQuil, go to sleep, right? Sleep it all off and wake up a day or two later and you feel better, right? That's what everybody wants to do. Everybody in here knows that NyQuil was really just designed to make you go to sleep, right? Well, think about bleeding for a minute. You go to the doctor, He bleeds out about a pint of your blood. That's going to make you tired. That's going to make you groggy. You then go to sleep. The next day you wake up, you feel better. See? So casual observation would tell these people there's something about bleeding that makes these conditions better. And the same is true like if you have a really upset stomach, right? Let's face it, nobody likes to throw up, but you always feel better after you're done, right? You always feel better once you get it out of you. Up until very much the modern era, parents would frequently give their children castor oil. If they ate too much sweets or they ate too much of something, castor oil was a common treatment. And what castor oil is, it's a laxative. That's all it is. And the logic being, let's get it all out of you, makes you feel better. Castor oil has no medical benefits. It's pointless, but nonetheless, it was something that was thought of as being helpful. So that's what that's all about. In any event, we're now going to start studying the human body on rational terms. Scientists are now going to start trying to understand how the human body actually works. There was a there was a 16th century, so we're talking about the scientific revolution. He's a little early, but a 16th century artist / anatomist named Vesalius. And he was the first to diagram the human body in real detail. He was the first to diagram the body in real detail. And a big part of figuring all of this out is understanding that the nerves and the blood vessels and the organs in our body are more or less uniform. Blood vessels are not randomly within each one of us. We have the same ones. We all have a femoral artery. We all have an aorta. We all have this and that. And that tells us that we're all pretty much the same. We're all pretty much the same under the surface. In 1628, here's more of Vesalius, or here's more diagrams. Our muscles, right? The muscles within our body are all pretty much uniform from one person to the next. And these are all done on cadavers, by the way. What he would do is he would dissect human cadavers and put all the muscles out there, and there we go. Here's a human brain, of course. Now, the human brain to a casual observer would look very random, but it turns out all those different folds and curves and blood vessels in your brain are the same as the person next to you. The same as the person next to you. And the brain contains a variety of smaller organs, and they all play a role. And they are similar from one person to the next. We all have a hippocampus. We all have a hypothalamus. We all have a pituitary gland, et cetera, et cetera. Here we go. William Harvey, in 1628, is the first to diagram the circulatory system. He was the first to diagram the circulatory system. And he figures out arteries take blood away from the heart, veins take blood to the heart, and of course, what connects arteries and veins together? I need to send you all to anatomy class. What connects arteries and veins together? Everybody knows. What? No, the vessels that connect arteries and veins. Capillaries. Capillaries. You've got the arteries and the veins, and they get smaller and smaller, and the capillaries connect them both together. And he was the first person to discover this and diagram it, exactly. He was the first person to discover it and diagram it. Now, oddly, the medical community does tend to be pretty conservative. It does tend to be pretty set in its ways. And so it takes a little longer than we would think before doctors really start embracing new medicine. Doctors were bleeding people well up into the 19th century, even though it was long disproven by that point. Doctors took a long time to embrace antiseptics, for example. The germ theory of disease was something that they had a really hard time embracing, even years after it had been more or less demonstrated. So the medical community moves a lot slower than we would think scientists would. But nonetheless, it's eventually going to get there. Robert Boyle is another important scientist. Robert Boyle is another important scientist. And he is the father of modern chemistry. He is the father of modern chemistry. And he is able to demonstrate that matter is comprised of very tiny particles. And he begins to chart the periodic table, of course, with elements on it. And he pioneers chemical experimentation and controlled chemical reactions. And after Boyle, chemists all throughout the world, or all throughout the Western world, now try to discover the new elements. Now that we have figured out that there's these different elements, we were there to sort, others began to try to sort that out. And actually, Boyle is just building on something that the ancient Greeks had figured out much earlier than that. There were ancient Greeks that had figured out that itty-bitty particles make up everything. And they even were the ones that coined the term atoms. They were even the ones that coined the term atoms. By some measures, of course, the scientific revolution is still underway, isn't it? We haven't really stopped the scientific revolution. Once it began, it has been a movement that continues. Science is a field that so many of us go into, and the most important part of science is not practicing science, but learning more. The best scientists are the ones that research and figure out and build on what others before them have done. That's what a real scientist does. And so if you're going into a scientific field, always keep that in mind. Your job is to find the next set of knowledge. Your job is to build on what somebody behind you worked on, because that's how we progress. That's how we progress. And we should always embrace that. We should always embrace that. We have cell phones and automobiles and all kinds of computers and all this cool stuff because we built on what other people had done. And you don't necessarily see the results in your lifetime. We have weather satellites that warn us when hurricanes come, and that goes back to Galileo, doesn't it? That goes back to the early astronomers. And had those early astronomers not began doing that, we would not have what we have today. So we have to keep moving forward. Okay, let's draw a line in our notes. I want to talk about a new topic. I want to begin with a brand new topic. I want to talk about the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the modern Islamic world. The Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the modern Islamic world. And this is considerably more complex than I am discussing. We're really only able to scratch the surface. But we do have to get started somewhere. And this is something that carries all the way up to the present day. First, and very briefly, because this really is a Civ I topic, everybody in here, of course, is familiar with Islam. It is a religion that is, historically speaking, founded by a man named Muhammad in the 7th century. It is a religion that, from a history perspective, was founded by Muhammad in the 7th century. Islam is similar to Christianity in that it uses much of the same scripture and holds much of the same beliefs, but Islam is not Christianity. There are new beliefs that make it theologically incompatible with Christianity. Similar but not the same. Similar but not the same. Muslims believe that Muhammad was the final prophet of God. Muslims believe this. And Muhammad is a historic figure. You could go to his grave today. He is not somebody who we question whether or not he lived. Muhammad was definitely a real guy. Now, what is this to Civ II? Well, during the 7th and 8th centuries, Islam spread throughout North Africa into what is today the Middle East and even into present-day Spain. It spread very rapidly over a few generations. There are many different cultures, many religions, many different people that embraced Islam as it was spreading. There is no single Islamic culture. There are many different people that consider themselves Muslim. And so from this, very powerful nations would emerge. Powerful states would pop up with Islam as their base religion. One of these states would be created by people we call the Turks. One of these states would be by people we call the Turks. And there is no single tribe of Turks. The Turks themselves were diverse. Islam clashed with Christianity as it was spreading. And again, a Civ I topic here, but the Crusades were a big part of this. The Reconquista in Iberia, what is today Spain, was a big part of this. And if we look in southeastern Europe and the far sort of western part of Asia, which we call Asia Minor, the Turks had a long-standing feud with the Byzantine Empire, which was the successor to Rome itself. The Byzantine Empire had existed for hundreds of years. It was a devoutly Christian empire. And it was considered to be the wall between the Christian world and the Islamic world to a lot of people. And the Byzantines sort of nonstop fought with the Turks and other Muslims to keep Islam out of Europe. This was the core of the Crusades. This was a big part of Christian identity and European identity for generations. And it was a losing battle. Because over the generations, the Turks got stronger and the Byzantines got weaker. And the two cultures were not really willing to coexist. The Byzantines were not willing to relax and allow Islam to come in, and the Islamic world was not willing to allow Christians, not in any great sense. Now, there would still be Christian groups within the Islamic world, but generally speaking, Christianity was not encouraged once the Muslims came in. Around the 13th century, a man by the name of Osman became the founder of a new Turkish tribe. He sort of emerges as a tribal leader, and a new tribe of Turks begin to rally around him, and we will simply call them the Ottomans. And I'll move over here to him. Osman would aggressively gain territory from the Byzantines. He would aggressively gain territory from the Byzantines. And by the time he is in charge, the Byzantine Empire is in a rapid state of decline. It is in a rapid state of dissolution. It is beginning to simply fall apart. So there's really no question that the writing is on the wall that the Byzantine Empire at some point will collapse. It's just a question of when. The Ottomans begin to take territory along the Black Sea. They begin to take territory in the Mediterranean. They begin to set up the mechanisms of government. Their leader would start to be called the Sultan. by the year 1400, the Ottomans now have a very real presence in Eastern Europe, and they are surrounding the Byzantine Empire, what's left of it, and there really isn't much left of it. The grand city, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, is the old Roman capital of Constantinople. It is by some accounts the largest and most significant city in the Western world at this time. It is the bridge between Europe and Asia. And in 1453, the Ottomans captured it. And you can see Constantinople here. It's right in between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Strategically, it is extremely important for that reason. And in 1453, it is now Ottoman. The Byzantine Empire ceases to exist, and we now have the emergence of the Ottoman Empire. And if we're going to be truly technical about it, this is the final fall of Rome, because the Byzantine Empire was the last of what had been the Roman Empire, and the fall of Constantinople means Rome is truly gone. It means Rome is truly gone. That is actually why the Russian emperor started calling himself Tsar, because once Rome fell, the Russian emperor declared himself Roman emperor. And so he declared himself Caesar, which in Russian would simply be Tsar. The Ottoman Sultan will also take that title, but it wouldn't be anything that he pays much attention to. In any event, the Ottomans proceed to create a very powerful empire that bridges Europe, Asia, and North Africa. And again, I'll go back to this. I hate to keep jumping around a lot. But they will create an empire that bridges Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The northern part of the Red Sea, large sections of the Black Sea, and of course, the Eastern Mediterranean, all Ottoman water, with enormous amounts of coastline, millions of people, many different cultures, all ruled from Constantinople by the Turks. The Ottomans did not stop. Once they captured Constantinople. The goal was to just keep on trucking all the way into Europe. And so it goes without saying that the leaders of Europe are a little bit concerned about this. You know, the leaders of Europe had been concerned about this for a long time. It was the basis of the Crusades, after all, which were now a few hundred years earlier. But now the leaders of Europe understand this is a very real threat to their own sovereignty. This is a threat to Christianity, but this is a threat to the very governments themselves, because the Ottomans just keep taking one region after another. And the Ottomans were extremely well organized and very effective in their expansion. The Ottoman military was first rate and extremely large. You know, the soldiers of the Ottoman military were very well trained, very well equipped, extremely disciplined. The Ottoman Empire developed a highly skilled officer corps, and it makes no secret of its desire to keep on moving. It makes no secret of its desire to keep on moving. The most significant of these Ottoman emperors was Suleiman I, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman I, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent. Ottoman sultans always sort of have something associated with them. You know, we have Osman the Warrior or Suleiman the Magnificent, whatever. That would always be kind of a thing the sultans do. And that big, gigantic onion on his head is the crown. Yes, it looks ridiculous, but you wouldn't tell that to him if you were in his presence. But that big, huge turban is actually the crown that they would wear. Suleiman eyes Western Europe, Central and Western Europe, much like the Russians identify the West, identify Europe as a place that they should embrace. Well, Suleiman was kind of the same way, only his goal isn't to, bring in the scholars and westernize the Ottoman people. He wanted to conquer. I mean, his goal is to rule it all. And he actually invaded and almost conquered Vienna. If you look here on the map, you'll see the Ottoman Empire is very, very close to Vienna, which is the capital for the Habsburgs. And in 1529, a Turkish army actually laid siege to Vienna and almost took the city. And had they done that, that would have opened the door for them to expand into the German states, possibly even France, you name it. And Vienna, to many of the Europeans, was seen as the line that has to be drawn. The European leaders were not going to allow Vienna to fall. And so once the Habsburgs were under siege and once the Ottomans are there, they all rallied behind and came together, and multiple armies came to push the Ottomans back. And Suleiman failed. He did not capture Vienna. And that really marks the extent to which the empire would expand. That marks the extent to which the empire would expand. Once it is put together, the Ottoman Empire has a very stable, very prosperous couple of centuries. If you were to get in a time machine, if the DeLorean were to pull up and you were to jump in and we were to take you back to this era, you would probably be a heck of a lot more comfortable living in the Ottoman Empire than you would in some of these Christian kingdoms. The reality is the sultans did a pretty good job of enabling people to have a good quality of life. Cities were clean, cities were well managed, crime and disorder tended to be low, knowledge and higher learning tended to be much higher in Ottoman cities. Once the empire was established, there are millions and millions of Christians, because he's invading Christian lands after all. And as a general rule, the sultans were pretty tolerant of Christians. You're free to worship Christianity if you really want. Islam was encouraged. You can't really move up in the government or anything if you're not a Muslim, but Christians were not necessarily persecuted. The Sultan basically wants you to do two things, and if you do that, you're fine by him, and that is pay your taxes and recognize him as the boss, right? You obey his law, pay his taxes, and when it really gets down to it, he doesn't care what you worship, for the most part. As a matter of fact, the personal bodyguards of the Sultan were known as janissaries, and they had a tradition of being Christian. The janissaries actually had a tradition of being Christian, and they were the Sultan's sort of personal armed guard. The empire traded a lot, particularly in the Mediterranean. The Italians traded with the Ottomans quite a bit, and Italian merchants would come back with stories of Constantinople under the Turks and point out that it's actually a pretty cool place, not a bad place to live. That being said, beginning about the year 1600, and this is a very vague date, the empire starts to show signs of decline. It goes to its zenith, but starting about 1600, now we're going to start seeing it slip. We're going to start seeing problems. This is a very gradual decline. This is not something that happens immediately, but eventually it's going to start being a problem. And there isn't one single culprit in this, but instead a series of challenges that the empire is going to have a hard time dealing with. One problem that the empire has is that its borders were just vast. Thousands of miles of borders, all surrounded by people that for the most part don't like them. Up north, there are the Russians and the Poles, which are just in a constant state of conflict with the Ottomans. There are the Central Europeans, the Austrians, which are no fans of them. If we go to the east, there are the Persians, who are always fighting with them over borders. There are the Arab people to the south, which are much more tribal, but they always cause problems. North Africa. All these different borders that sort of have to be defended and secured. And that costs a lot of resources, and that is very difficult and very challenging. The Turks can just never have peace on their borders anywhere. And when you have to put all of your money into your military, that means you don't have money for infrastructure and institutions that will improve the quality of life of people. There is also the problem that comes up that is associated with the bewildering mix of diversity that we see within the empire. I mean, you've got every flavor of human being imaginable living in the Ottoman Empire. Everything from Africans to Arabs, Persians, Turks are, of course, the core people, all these different versions of people in Eastern Europe. It is a really, really diverse mix. And governing all of it is just too much for any one person to deal with. Governing all of it is just a level of complexity that simply does not work well. And so to keep the peace and keep all of these different groups of people comfortable, to keep them cooperative, the central government was willing to grant concessions that would not be sustainable long term. And these concessions frequently involved cronyism and nepotism, putting people in positions of authority that were not particularly well qualified for. For example, let's say you are you are an important person in Egypt, and you are the Sultan's man in Egypt. Now, Egypt is big, and Egypt is influential, and Egypt produces a lot of food and brings in a lot of gold. Egypt matters. And you're a capable leader, and you're talented, and you're skilled. And I'm the Sultan, and you rule in my name, and we're good friends. And you come to me and you say, I'm able to keep Egypt in line, and I'm able to keep the gold flowing, and I'm able to keep the food flowing. And I would really like my son to succeed me. Well, your son isn't anywhere near as talented as you. As a matter of fact, your son isn't really cut out for the job. But what's going to happen if I say, no, your son can't do it, I'm going to put somebody else in charge? What are you going to do? You're going to quit being my friend, aren't you? All of a sudden, the gold might not show up. All of a sudden, the food might not show up. All of a sudden, there might be a revolt in Egypt, and you might be a little slow to put it down. So what am I going to do with Sultan? I'm going to say, fine, tell you what, put your son in charge. His incompetence isn't going to be my problem anyway. We'll both be past the finish line whenever that happens. And then now the son's in charge, who's less talented. And what does he do when he goes to the Sultan? Yeah, my idiot son. No, if you think I'm bad, you ought to see the kid that I had. And if you want Egypt to keep going, you got to help me out. Are you following me? We got all these generals on the borders. And generals want to make sure that their families are well taken care of. And so the general goes to the Sultan and says, yeah, I can keep the Persians at bay, but I think I need a raise, don't I? Now, the Sultan could say, no, I'm not going to do that. Or the Sultan could pass this guy an awful lot of wealth to make sure that he does the job. You see, it's a lot easier to pacify people with minor concessions. And ultimately, the empire just bargains away so much of that we start seeing people in positions of leadership that are incompetent. We start seeing military leaders that are not really capable, that were never really trained. We begin to see a whole range of corruption in that regard that just sort of eats the empire away from the inside. But you see, short term, it works for them. Short term, I'm the Sultan, I can do this sort of thing. We see a tremendous amount of incompetence all the way to the top of the government. We see a tremendous amount of incompetence all the way to the top of the government. Sultans themselves started off being experienced and trained. You know, the children of Suleiman, he would put them in positions of leadership because he knew one of them was going to succeed him. But of course, what happens if I'm the Sultan and I make one of my sons an important general and you're an important governor and you're another general over here and then I die? What's going to happen? Y'all are all going to start fighting each other over who gets to be the next Sultan, right? And so all of a sudden we have sort of a civil war going on within the royal family. Now, European families, European leaders like the Habsburgs and the Bourbons sorted that out through law. We know who the next king's going to be, and it doesn't matter what anybody says. But in the Ottoman Empire, it just didn't work that way. And the Sultan would have many different wives, many different children. You know, sultans could have dozens of sons. And so every time the Sultan goes, you have all of these siblings fighting each other. Competence doesn't matter. They bargain away concessions in order to get certain people to get behind them. It got so bad that once a new sultan was selected, his first act, the tradition of his first act would be that he murdered all of the male relatives that could challenge him. All of his brothers or any other male relatives would simply be executed right after he becomes sultan so that nobody could challenge him to the throne. And so that level of leadership is just not going to work well when you're dealing with an empire of this kind of complexity. We have some other sultans that they all have names. We have, Osman the warrior, Suleiman the magnificent. Then, of course, we have Selim the just okay. And then there's Ahmed II, who is Ahmed the looks just like Salem. And we don't want to forget Mustafa I, and he's, oh wait, y'all can't see this here. We have Selim the just okay, and then Ahmed, doesn't he look like the other guy before him? There's Mustafa, it's good he only lasted a year because nobody liked him. This is a picture of the siege of Vienna in 1529. And even to this day, the people of Austria take pride in the fact that they were able to hold off the Turks. They take pride in the fact that they were able to hold off the Turks. Now, the Turks actually invaded a second time. In 1683. Now, the empire is weaker than it had been before, but it is still quite powerful. Once again, the Turks attempt to capture Vienna. Once again, Europe rallies to drive them off. And historians generally put this event as really the beginning of the end for the empire. At this point, the empire really begins to decline very, very quickly, with the leadership becoming very corrupt, sultans becoming incompetent, assassinations were common, etc., etc. And here's a neat little story to go along with that. The people of Austria were really, really worried that this time they're going to lose Vienna. The Turks were absolutely on the gates of the city. But of course, they won. The Turks began to retreat, and the retreat took place in the middle of the night. Now, the first people up in the morning were the first ones to learn that the Turks had withdrawn and that the city would not be captured. And who do you think the first people up in the morning would be in a city like Vienna in 1683? Who are the people whose job requires them to get up about an hour or two before everybody else rises? Who might it be? And it's okay if you can't think about it, but it makes sense. Well, what's the first thing you do in the morning? You get up, you get dressed, and then, of course, what do you have to do? You got to eat breakfast, right? And so the people that get up before everyone else are the bakers. The people that would bake all the bread so that the bread is ready whenever the rest of the population gets up. And so the bakers were the ones that learned from the military that the Turks had withdrawn and that Vienna was saved. And so to celebrate, they created a roll that was shaped like a crescent moon, which of course is the symbol of Islam. Islam, the crescent moon is the symbol of Islam. And those are crescent rolls. And we've been eating them ever since. So every time you eat a crescent roll, you're celebrating the defeat of the Turks in 1683. And I guarantee you, nobody knew that, did you? But that's where crescent rolls actually come from. Anyway, Here are some other. Here are just some other images. This is an image of what a Ottoman cavalry soldier would have looked like. Here is a picture of Constantinople that was painted by merchants from Italy. And again, they would come back and sort of at its peak, they would describe Constantinople as a terrific city. You know, it's for a city that size, it is clean and it is well organized and the people are disciplined and it is affluent. The Ottoman Navy in the Mediterranean was very powerful. It really kept things like piracy and criminal activity very much down, and it was a very safe place to do business. Here are either garden gnomes or janissaries. I'm not exactly sure which. Probably a little bit of both, right? The janissaries started out as these elite warriors that protected the Sultan, but just like every other part of the empire, they became corrupted as well. And in the later years of the empire, the janissaries were more political figures. And there would even be times where they controlled the Sultan, and they would pick the Sultan because they would have so much power and authority. If they didn't like the Sultan, they would kick him out and put somebody else on the throne. And so the janissaries' role evolved over the course of the years. This is one of the palaces that the Sultan would live in. It's known as the Topkapi Palace, and it was built on over the years. It started out small, and then over the years, different sections were added onto it, and so that's why it's so eclectic. But it is one of the two palaces. The second palace was built toward the end of the empire that is much bigger and much more modern, much more European in style. And this here is known as the Church of Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia, and it actually dates back to the Byzantine Empire. This was built in the 6th century, so this is one of the oldest Christian churches in the world, and it was constructed by the Byzantine emperor, a man by the name of Justinian, and of course it was already an old structure once the Turks took over in the 15th century, and they converted it into a mosque. But the dome on top of it is really an architectural wonder. It is a concrete dome that represents the architectural ability of the Byzantines that came before the Ottomans. And it's still there today. It's in downtown Istanbul, which is the new name of the city. This is the inside of it. For hundreds of years after the Ottomans took over, they used it as a mosque instead of a Christian church. Today it is officially a museum, which means you can go in and you can tour it, and it's really, really cool to go to. Not that I've been there myself. But what's really neat is that over the course of the past couple of decades, the Turkish government has allowed some of the plaster to be taken down and which reveals some of the very, very early Christian murals that were put up there by the Byzantines. And so these are 5th century murals that are on the wall. We have Mary, and then there's Jesus and saints and so much. And these had been covered up for hundreds of years by the Muslims. They covered them up with plaster, and of course now it's available again. So it's really neat to go to. And it also raises a lot of questions as to, when we deal with very, very old structures, revealing one part might mean destroying another. And so what's important and what isn't, and all of that debate has to be made here as well. But Istanbul, which was Constantinople, it's had its name changed. Definitely worth checking out. Well, the empire is going to end up declining, of course. Beginning about the year 1700, we begin to see different regions start breaking away. Different ethnic groups decide, we don't want to be part of this anymore, and they start to split off. And the empire simply doesn't have the ability to hang on to them. The leadership is not competent enough. The military is not strong enough. The age of exploration really hit the tax revenue hard because for generations, traders would have to travel across Ottoman lands, but now they didn't have to. They could take ships, and so that cut into the ability to collect taxes. And so different groups begin to split away. The first group to do so was in North Africa. Egypt would eventually become independent before the year 1800, and what is today Libya, Algeria, these regions would split off. The Russians would begin to take territory along the Black Sea. The Russians and the Ottomans were kind of always at war with each other. And so the Russians would begin to move in and take advantage of the weakening empire on the Black Sea. Greece would become independent about 1820. Greece would become independent in about 1820. And by now, the Ottoman Empire has gained the nickname, the sick man of Europe. The sick man of Europe. It's big and apparently very powerful, but in reality, it is in a state of decline. In reality, it is in a state of decline. Finally, by the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire is only about 40% of what it had been under Suleiman the Magnificent. And it's still quite large. You can see that yellowish area. It's still a pretty darn big place. But many, many different ethnic groups have now split away. Many of them have formed their own states. The Ottoman military is considered second rate, and that's being generous. The Ottoman Navy virtually non-existent. The Arab regions are now openly trying to break away and form their own states. And so the Turks are really under siege to control any of it moving forward. When World War I broke out, a lot of it had to do with this declining state of the Ottoman Empire. Because in Eastern Europe, former Ottoman regions, former Ottoman states, were now trying to carve their own place and create their own borders. And one of these people, known as the Serbs, was fighting with the Habsburgs because the Serbs wanted to create a greater Serbia and a more powerful Serbia now that they were free from Ottoman control. And of course, the Habsburgs and the Austrians were not thrilled about that. And of course, there were other people in that region that thought that they ought to have their own borders. And so a big part of what would lead to World War I is directly connected to the fact that the Turks could no longer hold on to any of that territory. But when the war broke out, the Ottoman Empire sided with the Germans. The Ottoman Empire became an ally of the Central Powers. Now, we all know who lost World War I, right? So that means the Ottoman Empire loses the war. And when the war ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire basically just dissolved. All of the different regions that were non-Turkish were carved into new countries. The British and the French played a big role of that. And so nations like Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, these are all connected to the end of World War I when the British came in and just divided up these territories, drew new borders, paid no attention at all to the ethnic elements of this. They were just arbitrary borders, which plays a big role in why that's still kind of a problem today. And so you can see, you can see all kinds of new borders as a result of this. Just well over a dozen nations today were all part of the empire at one time. And the modern state of Turkey emerged in about 1923. The modern state of Turkey emerged in 1923. Turkey was declared a republic. The last sultan was ejected. And the founder of modern Turkey is a man by the name of Ataturk. Now, his real name was Mustafa Kemal, but that doesn't matter. He called himself Ataturk. And he is sort of the George Washington of modern Turkey. And he declared Turkey a republic. The emperor left, the sultan left. The sultan was Mehmed VI. Also, he was Mehmed. If anyone else wants this stupid job, they can have it. And as I understand it, he retired on the Italian Riviera and proceeded to not care about anything else until he died. Now, the modern state of Turkey still has Constantinople as its capital, but they changed the name to Istanbul at this time. And so it's Istanbul today, but it's the same city. They did change the capital, to Ankara. They did move the actual capital to the modern city of Ankara, which is more inland. But Istanbul is still the dominant city. It's the primate city in Turkey today, even if it's not the political capital. So I'll ask you this. Are the Turks our allies, or are the Turks our adversaries? Are we friends with the Turks, or are we not friends with the Turks? What's our relationship with Turkey today? Who in here says, this sounds like people we wouldn't be friends with? Who says, we're not friends with the Turks? Show of hands. Raise your hand if you want. Yeah, there we go. Who says, no, we're friends with them? Yeah, okay. Well, y'all are right. Y'all are actually right. Turkey is not just an American friend. Turkey is actually an American military ally. Turkey is a member of NATO, which means that we are military compatriots. If Turkey were to be attacked, we would immediately go to war with anyone that attacked them, and vice versa. We share military technology with them. We are very much on the side of the Turks and vice versa. That being said, within Turkey itself, there is a lot of debate over whether or not they really want to be our friends. It's not 100%. There's division there. And Turkey today still sits on that bridge between Asia and Europe. Are the Turks really Asians? Are the Turks culturally European? It really kind of depends on who you talk to. The Turks sort of see themselves as their own unique ethnicity, but the movement among the Turks, some say we need to develop a more European identity. There's been a big push for democracy, a big push for free speech. All of that, of course, is guaranteed in the Constitution today. It is, they do vote and elect their president. But then there's those Turks that say, nah, we're not so sure that we like being part of the West. We are more of an Asian people. And so Turkey still kind of has that issue. The government of Turkey is not the most stable. There have been a number of coups over the past few decades. The current leader of Turkey is quite a bit more of a dictator than he really needs to be. But nonetheless, we are officially their friends. We are officially their allies. South of Turkey, if you go to places like Syria and Jordan and Iraq, there is a lot of chaos in the Middle East. We know that. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that those borders were arbitrarily drawn. And these people don't really have a long history of working together the same way we would like them to. And they didn't, pick their own nations. And of course, the existence of Israel there doesn't help much. If you go to the non-Turkish people, if you go to the people of Syria and the people of Jordan or whatever, and I've had students and I've asked them about this, and you ask them what they think of the pre-independence days, they are not fans of the Ottoman Empire. They do not see being part of this grand empire that was so influential as a positive. They tend to say, we're all a lot better off now that the empire is dissolved. There's no nostalgia for it today. Even in Turkey, the people of Turkey have no interest in celebrating the sultans or anything like that, really. They're more than happy to consider themselves a modern state. And I've had some, I had a student, I've had more than one student from Lebanon, and I asked them, what's taught about the empire days? What's taught about the days prior to World War I? And he says, we're always taught that we were a colonized people, that the Turks were not good to us, and we're all very happy to be away from them. So there's a lot of complexity to that. Any questions before we move on? Because we've got to move on to a new topic. Anything? Okay, let's draw another line in our notes, and let's keep going. And I want to talk about China and Japan. And I don't know that we'll get to all of it today, but we do need to discuss it. We're moving to a new part of the world. Everybody in here knows that China has been around a really long time. I don't need to tell you that. The Chinese are the oldest continuous civilization on the planet. They're the oldest continuous civilization on the planet. China is at least, China as we would understand it, is at least 5,000 years old. Quite possibly older than that. In fact, China has been around so long as China that historians break it up into a series of periods that they simply call dynasties, where different Chinese governments and different Chinese systems were in place. And dynasties, of course, have lasted short periods and long periods. But Chinese scholars don't even, the Chinese scholars don't even study all of it. The Chinese scholars themselves break themselves into different groups because there's so much of China to understand. You can't be an expert on all of it. It's just not possible to be an expert on all of it. Now, very quickly, we've got to do a little World Civ I here. There are two very large rivers that run through China, and they are the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. There are the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And it is in these river valleys that Chinese culture really emerged and really thrived. These rivers are excellent for agriculture. And when you get agriculture, you get civilization. Also, further east, and you can see on this map, you can see these rivers, well, further east in the eastern section of China, there are a series of very rugged mountain ranges that are largely uninhabitable. There's big sections of China today that are uninhabited simply because these mountains are too rocky, too mountainous, too much. And so what that does is it keeps China from the west. You know, those mountains serve as a natural barrier that keeps the Chinese people isolated from other parts of Asia and other parts of that giant continent. Two early dynasties that really matter are the Shang dynasty, which emerges about the 16th century BC, and the Zhou dynasty, which emerges in the 11th century BC. These are ancient dynasties in China. The Zhou dynasty lasted somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 years. And again, this is just one ancient dynasty in China, and it's 800 years old. So again, we're talking about a long time here. Let's put on our analytical minds here. These are artifacts that date to the Zhou dynasty. Just by looking at these artifacts, what does this tell you about the Chinese people? What can you derive just from a casual observation? We have what appears to be a knife, we have a big vase, and then we have a drinking vessel. What does that tell you? What do you know right away? They're very artistic. Absolutely. You know, the artisanship that went into these, just look at the knife itself. The artisanship that went into this is very impressive. So, what we know is that a civilization that can produce artisans with this level of skill is going to be a civilization that is stable. It's going to be a civilization that trades and has commerce, because whoever created this intended to sell it. And you're going to have an upper class that is willing to buy something of this caliber. So there's stability, there's trade, there's commerce, there is probably literacy. And when you look at the other vessels, you see writing on them. So we automatically know these people write. We can pretty much assume that there is a very diversified class structure. Whoever did this only does this for a living. And so that means there's lots of different people that do lots of different things that are very impressive and very skilled related. So we're looking at an advanced civilization. We're looking at advanced people when we look at such remarkable artifacts. Here is the bottom of a tortoise shell. I need to flip this image, but it has early Chinese script on it. It has early Chinese script on it. The Chinese written language is much more complex than the Latin language, which today is kind of a hindrance. But the Chinese were writing much earlier than people in other parts of the world. And here is a map of the Zhou dynasty. You can see it's bigger than the Shang, but it's still China, it's same place. In terms of religion, the Chinese are going to embrace Buddhism. Not all Chinese do, but one of the influential religious beliefs is Buddhism. And Buddhism actually comes from India, which is another indication that early China trades, that early China communicates. A major religious movement that comes from an entirely different people is an indication that a lot is going on in this part of the world. Buddhism embraces the idea of keeping your life very simple. Stress and pain and unhappiness come from constantly wanting more and more stuff. That's the idea behind Buddhism. And so you will be a happier person if you simplify, if you don't want all of the junk in life that we seem to spend all of our time working toward. The happiest people are the people that live simple lives that don't want it. I want you to think about when you were a kid at Christmas. And what do you want at Christmas? I want an Xbox, I want an Xbox, I want an Xbox. And you're harassing your parents left and right. Give me an Xbox, give me an Xbox, give me an Xbox. So they go out and they buy an Xbox, probably with money that they should have been saving up for your college, right? Bought an Xbox with money that could have gone for many other things, but we got to get that kid an Xbox because he won't shut up. And then you run down at the Christmas tree and you open up your Xbox and you've got it and you play it. And then, of course, 3 days later, where's the Xbox? It's in the corner, right? You're tired of it and you're done playing it. And now you want an Xbox One. Oh, I got to have an Xbox One, right? That Xbox is no good. Give me an Xbox One, right? And you got to figure out sooner or later, wait a second, all they're doing is taking advantage of me, right? The minute I get something, I want something else. And then the minute I get that. And so the Buddhists say, forget that. Quit wanting it. Quit allowing yourself to be manipulated by people that tell you how you're supposed to live. Relax, chill. Don't constantly want more things. And by that, I mean you, because I want my Xbox, okay? Anyway, on that note, it looks like we got to finish. So we also got to talk about the other Chinese ideas of balance, and we actually got to talk about modern China as we move into the modern era. So we're going to do that on Tuesday. But I am going to finish today because I got to start uploading this. If anybody has any questions, again, please let me know. Don't forget to check in on the attendance, okay? Check that attendance link because I do have to drop you if you don't. And I'll see everybody later.